Welcome, everyone, to the May meeting of the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan. I'm Lorraine DeCerbo, the editor, for those who don't know me. I believe I'm going to introduce Daniel Rio, who is our program coordinator, and he will let you know about any announcements, and we'll proceed from there.
Okay, thanks, Lorraine. Yeah, we're approaching 50 people on the Zoom currently. First, I wanted to let Gail have a chance to bring people up to date with the latest availability on books.
Well, I like to plug again The Burials of St. Anne, and I'm also working on the corresponding book from Assumption, Windsor, that starts in 1768 and will also go through 1805. And in the end, you'll probably need both books to complement each other, because the people crossed the border that didn't really exist at that point in time. We also have available a 2-volume set of Detroit 1701-1710, fully documented, and of everything that happened in Detroit in the first 9 years. That was done in conjunction with Diane Shepard, and also volume 2 is by the late Suzanne Somerville. Then Diane and I last year did the next set of books, which is 1711-1720, fully documented on those years in Detroit. It includes the parish registers, the contracts for the voyageur, etc. You can go to our website and you can find out how to order the books or get more details, or you can contact me at store@habitantheritage.org and I will answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenter for today. Lisa Elvin-Staltari is a genealogist and travel guide. While she currently resides in the Sun Belt of the U.S., Lisa grew up in Drummondville in Quebec's eastern townships. She is the host of the YouTube channel, Have Roots Will Travel. And part of that is just a rich amount of content on the Les Filles du Roi, the King's Daughters, who came to populate and the colony of New France in the mid 1600s. To date, Lisa, I think, has about 300 biography, the bio videos of these Filles du Roi ancestors of ours, and the spouses that they married, and she's certainly an expert in this area. And so with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you to the Society for hosting this presentation. I'm very eager to share the presentation that I prepared exclusively for you. Actually, I took a little bit from each seminar I've done. So let me share my screen. All right. Okay, let us begin with Les Filles du Roi and Filles Mariées, Myths and Misunderstandings. And I'm so happy to be able to speak to you and be able to shed some light on these amazing women who helped create New France, and their influence would spread eventually throughout North America. But let's have a look at the beginning. It's very important to kind of set the stage. So we have in 1608, Samuel de Champlain, who founded Quebec City and who established the Habitation, which was the first permanent settlement fortified with walls and a moat. Champlain is often called the father of New France. He led the colony's growth, and he forged alliances with indigenous peoples, encouraged exploration, and set the foundation for a lasting French presence in North America. He remained a key figure until his death in 1635. But along comes Louis Hébert and his family in 1617, and they became the very first private settlers in New France. They brought with them essential farming skills, and that marked the start of agriculture in the colony. And though the population grew very slowly at first, Hébert's farm became a symbol of stability and perseverance, showing that families and not just traders and soldiers were key to building a sustainable colony. Together, Champlain and Hébert represent the vision and courage that helped begin New France. But something happened that would stop this growth. And that was in 1629. For me, this is a major deal because here you go along, you're creating, and all of a sudden everything stops when the Kirke brothers capture Quebec for the English. And the Kirke brothers captured Quebec during the Anglo-French War, and they were acting as English privateers. They cut off French supply lines in 1628, which left Samuel de Champlain and the colony very weakened. And the brothers attacked the following year. Champlain surrendered without a fight, and they all kind of went back to France and waited things out. Now, Louis Hébert and his family, and I believe the Couillards stayed, but basically it was as if they had to start over. Eventually, through the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1632, France gets back the colony, but it's, a shell of itself. And so they had to restart. So Champlain comes back in 1633 and the colony begins again. But once you've stopped it, it takes a long time. And I think that is a critical understanding of why the colony didn't grow organically. In other words, because there was 3 years where they literally they had nothing going on. And that takes a lot to start the wheel going. You can all remember what happened with the supply chains during COVID. It just stops everything in its tracks. Now, by 1633, 34, we have the filles mariées, which are the beginnings of really building the colony. And these filles mariées were marriageable girls, they're called in English, between 1634 and 1662, 1663. These women were volunteers and often from very modest backgrounds who made the courageous decision to cross the Atlantic to help populate New France. Many paid their own passage or were sponsored by religious groups, unlike the later Filles du Roi, who received a royal support. Now, there's a myth that all these women were desperate or poor, but in fact, many came seeking adventure, opportunity, and a new life in the colony. They truly played a crucial role in stabilizing those early settlements, and marrying settlers and starting families at a time when women were really scarce. Now, there's only 262 of them, but their production, if you will, was immense. The first one, Françoise Grenier, in 1634, actually by 1729, just 1729, had over 1,300 descendants from that one, marriage. So it goes to show you that they came first, and there weren't that many of them, but you will find a lot of filles mariées if your history goes back to that very beginnings of New France. I want to kind of tell you profiles and courage. These are two of my favorite filles mariées. We have Belle Poisson, who arrived in New France with her brother, sister, and sister-in-law. She quickly proved to be a force to be reckoned with. This is from an account at the time. When there were no men nearby and a swarm of Iroquois warriors approached as far as her house, Barbe did not hesitate. She grabbed an armful of rifles and, showing no fear, she ran to support the French soldiers who were being pursued. She rushed to Monsieur Le Moyne, who was about to be overtaken. Reaching him just in time, she handed him the weapons, which greatly strengthened the French defense and helped hold the enemy at bay. Just an incredible story. Jeanne Rousselier is another one that I absolutely love. And why? Because she came to New France during the Grand Recru of 1653. Many of you are familiar with that. She was a true pioneer and helped to establish settlements in Quebec, Montreal, and eventually Acadia, always pushing the frontier forward. So I love that about her. Now, the plan. By 1663, the king said, this isn't working, the colony is not thriving, and he took back ownership of the the New France, which was at that time kind of governed by the 100 Associates. And they obviously did not do the kind of job that the king was hoping for. So he said, okay, let's regroup. And Jean Talon came up with a plan, and his name, of course, resonates in modern day Montreal and Quebec. He was kind of the chief operating officer, and he was appointed by King Louis XIV and his minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Talon served as the intendant of justice, public order, and finances for Canada, Acadia, and Newfoundland during 2 terms. So Talon was really deeply committed to building the colony and addressing this really pressing challenge, really about the sparse population. Now, he said, perhaps we can organize these women, give them a bonus, a signing fee, give them everything they need in order to make a new life, and kind of really recruit in the same way that you would an army. He recruited women to be able to come to New France and build. So think about it like that they really were, from their backgrounds, they were really doing like kind of a military operation. So they basically said, we need to have this many women, and we're probably in the high stages of it, 100 to 125 women per year would come. So they really had a plan, and this plan was obviously worked extraordinary, because between 1663 and 73, approximately 770 women, and they were, we call them the king's daughters, but they weren't called that at that time. They were just les filles envoyées par le roi, the girls or the ladies sent by the king. They arrived in the colony, and they, the plan was to marry the settlers and have children. That was the key. Now, the recruiting process is interesting. So imagine these young women in France. First of all, a recruiter, or often a merchant or a ship outfitter working under royal commission, would travel to the various cities and ports searching for suitable candidates. These young women needed to present key documents, either a birth certificate, or baptismal certificate, and a recommendation letter from their parish priest or a local official, confirming their good character. And that's important, remember that part. And that they were free to marry, another thing to actually realize they had to prove. Once approved, the women signed a formal contract. In return, they received a wooden chest called a coffre, filled with essential items they would need for their new life in New France. Then came the moment of departure. It was time to board the ship. Now, these women were carefully selected. They had to be between the ages of 18 and 45, and they needed to be physically able to bear children. There was no way to prove that they could bear it, but basically you could prove that at least they had a shot. They weren't 50 or 12. Sometimes they were very, very young, but ultimately that was their purpose. Now, let's have a look at those ships. Now, the ships. Oh, sorry. Wait a minute, sorry. Now, the journey begins in ports such as Dieppe, La Rochelle, and Le Havre, and it was key embarkation points on France's western coast. These ports bustled with ships and sailors, merchants, soldiers, and immigrants. For many of the filles du roi, leaving these ports was the very first step into the unknown. Many of them had never left their villages. In all, 13 ships from 1663 to 1673 have been identified. The crossing itself was very dangerous and exhausting, often lasting 2 to 3 months, depending on the winds and weather. The ships were crowded with limited food and cramped quarters, and illness was common due to the poor hygiene and harsh conditions. Yet these young women endured, and that is why they survived. Now, it is said that about 10% of the ladies who boarded the planes would pass away on the ships, but we don't have any real documentations about that. Now, once the filles du roi arrived, they first arrived in Quebec City, where they were distributed across the colony. Now, 508 is said, again, these are our estimates. 560 stayed in Quebec City, 133 went to Montreal, and 75 to Trois-Rivières. While awaiting marriage, they lived in dormitory-style houses under the supervision of female chaperones, where they learned practical skills for their future roles as wives and homemakers. Now, these classes sometimes didn't last very long because the marriages happened very quickly, and other times they stayed on for a year. And so it really depended on the situation that each fille du roi would find her in. In Quebec City, the filles du roi were guided by Mother Marie of the Incarnation, now Sainte Marie, and Madame Marie-Madeleine de Chauvigny de la Pelleterie, key figures in the Ursuline convent. In Montreal, they were under the care of Marguerite Bourgeois, founder of the Congregation of Notre Dame, and they would say at Maison Saint-Gabriel, a farm managed by the Congregation. Maison Saint-Gabriel is now a museum. A great place to visit if you're ever in Montreal. I just was there a couple of years ago and just absolutely fell in love with the place. Now, their grooms. What kind of men were there? Well, there were three basic types of men. We have the engagés of New France, who were the crucial labor force in that French colony. Engagés were men who entered into contracts typically for 3 years to work in New France, often in very challenging conditions. So they were there, they had to finish their contract before they had the right to get married because they were, contracted. But once they were done their contract, they were given the opportunity for land and for jobs and farms and could begin building something that would appeal to a bride. So that was the situation of the early engagés. The Carignan-Salléas soldiers arrived a couple of years after the beginning of the program, but they also came in 1665, and about 1,200 of them showed up. About 400 stayed behind and married and started lives with the filles du roi in particular, and they by 1666 or 1667, you'll begin to see the marriages of the Carignan-Salléas soldiers and their brides. And finally, we have les Canadiens, I call them. These are the offspring of those early pioneers that we talked about, les filles mariées. By the time, you think about it, 1634, we have Jeanne Garnier, Garnier, who is, having children. Her children would be at least 20, 30 in that age group where they could marry. So all of the women who came before had children, and a lot of the Canadiens would go on to choose filles du roi or their children's children. So you really have to look at that. Now, I want to talk about the marriage record. Now, a lot of people know about this, but I want to make sure that I explain it because I think the marriage record is probably the most critical record beyond baptisms and deaths, because the marriage record tells us a story. It tells us all of the families of these. So I've translated it. And once you know that it's always the same, you kind of say, okay, even though I don't speak French, I can pick out the names. So on the 8th day of October, 1667, I'm sorry, between Michel Roy and son of Michel Roy and Louise Chevalier of the Poitiers, and Françoise Aubé, daughter of Pierre Aubé, and François Père, the father and mother of the parish of Saint-Sulpice in the city of Paris. So in this one document, you've got the names of the brides and groom, but also their parents, where they're from, and the parishes, which is very important. And you've got it for the maternal and paternal. So it tells you the story. It's like, wow, when you find this. And it is very important to be able to identify who their parents are, because then you can go back and look at the baptismals of the children. So the marriage record is often one I start with. If I can find the marriage record and then I can go back, I know which Michel Roy I'm talking about. I know which Françoise Aubé I'm talking about. So, and this was on the 8th day of October, 1668. Sorry, I just want to make sure. So, like I said, I cannot stress enough how important that marriage record is. Now, where the filles du roi settle, I put this in because I love to talk about the different places. You can see that all the circled ones are basically on this old road called Le Chemin du Roi in Quebec. It's the Route 138. I just did it a couple of years ago and literally went to every single place where the filles du roi would have settled. But it's important because as you go through your genealogy, you want to look, there are some key cities that you need to be aware of. So you know, oh, wait a minute, I know that that was an early settlement. So of course, Quebec City, 101, Charlebourg had 82, Neuville, a very small little place, but had 48 filles du roi. Montreal had 46. Now, the other places where they would settle would be places like Ile d'Orléans on the island. We have Trois-Rivières, Three Rivers, Betska, which is very close to Trois-Rivières, Sainte-Anne-de-la-Parade, Saint-Augustin-de-Damas, a tiny little place that had 13 filles du roi. I mean, go figure. Pointe-aux-Trembles, Rondet, Cap de la Madeleine. In each of these small communities, you will probably find, certainly even in Saint-Augustin-de-Damas, you will find that they celebrate the women that were there. So there's usually a plaque or there's something there that honors the filles du roi who settled that particular town. Now, the baby boom. So the filles du roi, coupled with the filles mariées, meant that in 40 years, 1,000 women had been brought over in one form or another. In other words, we also have the other females that came, of course, that were accompanied by their families. So the growth of Quebec in these times was that I just can imagine the parish priest being run off his feet, you know. Once married, there was an incentive to have large families. A yearly pension of 300 pounds was granted to families with 10 children, rising to 400 pounds for 12 children and more for larger families. As such, with a roughly 96% success rate, quite the baby boom followed. A whopping, and this is a statistic that I got from a study, 4,400 babies resulted from these families over the next decade or so. The genealogical impact, as you can imagine, is immense. Almost all Quebecers can trace their lineage back to at least one, and usually many, many more of these brave and courageous women, and may I say, quite savvy. The sheer number of babies born ensured that the lines of these women would extend far beyond the borders of Quebec. And this is one thing you must know about Quebec and babies. There were lots of them. And when I say lots, I mean lots. The priest would encourage and actually demand that women keep procreating. It was not uncommon to have 20 children. I once worked with a woman in the late 1990s who was about 30 years old or so. I asked her how many brothers and sisters she had. She replied nonchalantly, 21. I was dumbfounded that this was still going on even in so-called modern times. In my own life, my mom, who was French Canadian, married an Englishman. She used to tell me all the time, I knew that I'd be able to have just a few children and I wouldn't have to have 8 or 9. She came from a family of 8. And I can remember being about 7 or 8 years old, about 1970, and the priest came to our house, which was very unusual. And my mom told my brother and I to go to our rooms. After he had left, I asked, what's he doing here? My mom said simply, he wanted to know if I planned to have any more children. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him no, I was done, and there was nothing he could do about it, she said defiantly. I noticed, though, that she was kind of shook up. Such was the power of the church, even in that time period. Now, les filles du roi, wives and mothers, the founding mothers of a nation. We have Françoise Aubé, that we saw her marriage record, and we have another one, Catherine de Lalore. I want to talk to you about these two. They're really kind of they embody to me a lot of the strength of these filles du roi. Françoise Aubé would come to New France and marry Michel Roy, and they would settle at Sainte-Anne-de-la-Parade and would become the earliest pioneers there. Michel was a notary, and Françoise would eventually become a midwife. They would also proved to be very important to the future of Detroit that we'll see later. Catherine de Lalore would come from England, the product of a French mother and an English father. Upon her father's death, she'd come to New France as a fille de roi and establish herself with her Carignan-Sonneur soldier, Louis Badilla de la Plante, and they would settle at Sorel. Some of her descendants would also play a part at the beginning of Detroit. Now, let's talk about those myths. Myth number one, they were prostitutes. One of the most persistent myths in Canadian history is that the filles du roi, the king's daughters, were prostitutes or women of very low moral standings. Well, we saw the recruitment process. We saw that they had to produce a birth certificate. They had to have a letter of recommendation. Really and truly, it was kind of, how did this myth start? Well, one of the sources was the man who wrote, I'm going to read it in French and then in English. On nous envoie ici de petites filles qui ont plus besoin d'un couvent que d'un mari, which means they send us little girls here who are more in need of a convent than a husband. And this kind of tells you what they were thinking. This claim was repeated by several 17th and 18th century writers, including the Baron de la Hontan, who described them as of middling virtue and suggested they came to New France seeking religious absolution. Other early voices like Thelma Desraux and Paul Lejeune echoed these assumptions, often without any first-hand knowledge. But even in the 18th century, some contemporaries pushed back. Claude Lebeau in 1738 and Pierre-François Xavier de Charlevoix in 1744 both defended the character of these women, offering more respectful and realistic portrayals. We now know, thanks to modern scholarship and archival research, that these women were overwhelmingly devout Catholics. Many came from charitable institutions, hospitals, or were orphaned. They were carefully selected and supported by the crown, and their passage to New France was not taken lightly. To put it plainly, out of nearly 800 filles du roi, only 2 women that I can find, Catherine Guichelin and Catherine Besset, were ever formally charged with prostitution while living in Canada. And even then, their cases occurred after abandonment by their husbands and in desperate circumstances. The idea that these women were morally suspect has more to do with colonial bias, misogyny, and misinformation than with reality. In truth, they were foundational figures in the development of New France, mothers, wives, and community builders who deserve our respect, not ridicule. Now, I want to also tell you personally, when I first studied and became really interested in Les Filles du Roi, my people in Quebec, my neighbors and friends and all of that I grew up with said, what are you doing? These are prostitutes. They were French. And that was, even then, one of my best friends could not believe what I was studying and that I was going to study these prostitutes. And I had to explain to him that no, and that's what they had been taught or told. And he's a teacher and a very widely, read person. That was, the myth was so prevalent that even in my aunts and all of that did not really fully comprehend the importance of these women. And so it became my mission to be able to really prove what they really brought to New France and to us. Now, here's another myth. They were all poor orphans. Now, it's important to understand that the filles du roi were not all the same. While many were orphans, others had at least one living parent. Some came from charitable institutions, but many came from very stable, modest homes. What united them wasn't poverty. It was the opportunity to be part of a royal program to help build a new colony. Most brought a dowry of 100 to 200 pounds. So obviously they weren't that poor. Sometimes much more. I have cases of up to 1,000 pounds. The king also provided essentials and often a signing bonus, usually 50 pounds. But again, I've seen cases that they gave more based on the socioeconomics of that person and how desperately they wanted that person to come to New France. Their literacy levels varied, which was normal for women in the 17th century, but they had the backing of their parishes, communities, and often came from very, very respectable families. In fact, many had fathers who were civil servants, clerks, or worked at court. So it's no surprise that they would hear about the program early on. And some even came from very noble families. I have one filles du roi that I profiled, Catherine de Bayonne, who's a prime example. Her ancestry traces her back to French nobility and as far back as Charlemagne, which has been proven. Together, these women, whether they came from humble or distinguished backgrounds, became the ancestors of tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of French Canadians today. Here's another myth. They were forced to marry. One of the best parts of the selection process is that these girls had the right to pick her husband. This was a very different process than in France, where they were kind of, it was arranged marriages to some degree. They would also have the ability to change their mind, as evidenced by the many annulled or canceled contracts that were part of the courtship ritual. I've had cases where I've seen four cancellations, where they pick a guy, one man, and then they change their mind, and then sometimes they cancel it, and then they go back to the same guy. So it was really, the notaries were very busy, as well as the priests. The meetings between the filles du roi and prospective grooms in New France was very organized and very pragmatic. These gatherings often occurred in public spaces, like the governor's residence or parish halls, with chaperones ensuring very much propriety and respect for social norms. You can imagine these men who hadn't seen women for a while, and these women who were young and absolutely enchanted with these men. So you had to be very, very careful with these young ones. During these encounters, both men and women evaluated each other. Men sought wives who could endure the challenge of frontier life, while the women were looking for husbands who offered stability, land, or valuable trade skills. Conversations were practical, focusing on the man's living conditions, professions, and land, as well as the woman's domestic abilities and readiness for the rugged lifestyle. Decisions were made quickly, often after just one or two meetings, reflecting the urgency of New France's need for families. Now, remember when I was talking about les engagés and how they had to finish their contract? One of their big things, you'll see like somebody who was there from 1660 and his contract would have ended in 1663, let's say, he would get married like probably 1668 or thereabouts. He would have had time to build up a financial portfolio, to build a land, a house to bring their bride to. Because if they didn't have a house, the chances are that they were not really good prospects. And so that was definitely part of the equation. Here's another myth, that these filles du roi were the only women. They weren't the only women. We have the indigenous women that existed, and it is very much a fact that many French Canadians or men arriving from France, the Carignan soldiers included, did marry indigenous women. So this is part of that. And we also have they came with their families. There were women who were there, and they don't qualify as filles du roi or filles mariées because they came with their parents. So if they came with their parents, they would have been also prospective brides. And then, of course, we have the older filles mariées that had come as well. So we have that and their children. And so the myth that, wow, these men had no women, and then all of a sudden these women, it wasn't quite true. So certainly there was an influx of women by the filles du roi, but there were other women as well. Now, this is not really a myth, but it's more like a misconception. And now we refer to these women as filles du roi, daughters of the king. They were not called this during their own lifetime. In the 17th century, they were more commonly known as les filles envoyées par le roi, or simply les filles mariées, actually. The now familiar title of filles du roi only became widely used in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly through the writings of historians like Benjamin Suté and later Marcel Trudel and Yves Landry, whose work brought a broader recognition to their role in shaping New France. And I also use this photo to illustrate another important misconception. Les filles du roi had nothing to do with royalty, and this picture, which is so often used, goes towards another misconception, which is the opposite of the myth of prostitution. Do you know how many times people have said to me, oh, my ancestor was a royal daughter, and I want to know which king it was, that sort of thing. And so this particular painting was drawn by a lady, a British lady who actually did it. I don't know the exact date, but I know she died in 1945. So it was early 20th century or late 19th. So it goes to show you this was not, they were not being received by Jacques Talon or the Laval and that sort of thing. It would have been lovely. And the dresses they wore, certainly this was not how they would have been depicted. And a misconception number two, that they were subservient and docile. And in June of 1667, a remarkable event took place in the port city of Dieppe, France, one that sheds light on the resilience and strength of these filles du roi, even before they set foot in New France. About 20 young women preparing for the voyage across the Atlantic signed a formal complaint known as a requête against their supervisor, Catherine Françoise Desnoyers, I believe that's how you pronounce it, and the representatives of the Compagnie des Indes Occidentales. These women were not silent or passive. They spoke up. They reported being denied food and proper care while waiting for their departure, and they accused Desnoyers of making false promises on behalf of the king, promises that the company's agents never fulfilled. This wasn't just a complaint about logistics. It was a bold act of protest driven by a demand for dignity, respect, and basic survival. This event reminds us that the filles du roi were not simply poor or orphan women fit to marry. They were strong-willed women who stood up for themselves, even against powerful institutions. Throughout my research, I found many similar stories. Women who defended their families, sought separations from abusive husbands, or survived the deaths of multiple spouses. These women weren't just settlers, they were survivors. And in rare moments, like the 1667 petition, we get a glimpse of their voices, strong, united, and unafraid to speak truth to power. I want to share with you some of the names, because these women there were other names, but they did not leave descendants. But some of you in the audience may be a descendant of one of these women. So we have Françoise Conflat, Catherine de Belleau, Marie-Madeleine Grandjean, Élisabeth Hubert, Élisabeth Lequin, Marie Pasquier de Neufranchelieu, Geneviève Sagot, and Ursule Madeleine Chouard. And I say these names really because for me, saying the names of the women is such an important part of honoring their contribution. I like to think that somewhere in heaven, they're like kind of, proud that, yes, I did this, in my life. So they have gone unrecognized for so long. Now, I want to talk to you about a case study that I think is pertinent to the audience I'm speaking of. Now, this was early on in my practice, and it was, my client approached me with a simple yet intriguing question. I think my great-grandmother was from France. Can you find that out? I took on the challenge, but the answer I uncovered wasn't quite what she had expected. Here's what we started with. We knew that her great-grandmother's maiden name was Loranger, she called it. Her husband's name, Freeman Parker, and the general location where they had lived, Yolo County, California. But she didn't have any birth or marriage records for Aura and Freeman, just these fragments of family lore. So where do you begin with such limited information? The search led us back to Yolo County, where Aura Freeman and their son Chester once lived. Piece by piece, I began assembling their story, hoping to unlock the mystery of Aura's origins. One of the keys is to kind of place them. So I was able to find Aura in the 1940 census. That's how long ago this was. The 1950 census hadn't been made available. So Aura May is there. And then we see that she's born in California. I don't see Chester. I've got to see Chester to make sure it's my Aura May. 1930, I see Aura May, and then I see Chester. And then Aura May, if you look at where she comes from California, but in those other columns, it's where's your father from and where's your mother from? California and no talk of France. And then we have 1920. We have 1920, again, she repeats that she is from California and her parents are from California. One of the keys in looking at census records and seeing if they are valid is how often is the information repeated. I like to see at least 3 times. In 1910, I have Aura, and we have California, California, California. But here is that little circle that says to me in the 1910 census, they wanted to know how were they, when were they married? And they were married a year at that time. So now I've got to look for that marriage record. I kind of know it'll be 1908, maybe 1909. So let's have a look. I was able to find the marriage record between Freeman Parker and Ora Mae Lorenzer, which is how I was calling her at the time. But in my head, I knew it was Lahaji. I knew. And it said that they had been married July 16th, 1908. Well, that didn't tell me much. Didn't tell me anything at all. But thankfully, there was a marriage announcement. And in that marriage announcement that I found in the Yolo County Democrat, by the way, which is an amazing paper, Miss Loranger is the oldest daughter of B. Loranger of Madison. Okay, so I've at least got, she's an older daughter of someone with a first name of B, and it's Madison. So let's go back and see 1900 census and see if I can find her. Yep, there she is. Ora Mae is the first daughter named. And I've got a name for her father, Beaumont or Beaumont. And he is from California, but finally we get out of California. His father is from Michigan and his mother is from Canada. So let's have a look at, now we forget about Ora Mae for a minute and we're looking for Beaumont. So in the 1880 census, we find Beaumont living with a man, probably his father, B.I.R. Loranger. So now we've got another initial. And then in the 1870 census, it becomes Isadore R. Perfect. There is Beaumont. And we see that Isadore is born in Michigan. Now, I want to go back to the 1880 census. He's from Michigan, we know that, but he then says his father is from Canada and his mother is from Michigan. Oh my goodness, where are we going with this? So the funeral rites for B. Loranger, this is a picture of Beaumont, and it does, I always like to verify that this is my correct Beaumont, and his brother was named Francis R. Loranger, and I see Regis here. And so I know that that particular Francis Regis Loranger, I know that this is the same fellow that is the brother of Beaumont. So now let's find Isadore. Isadore Regis, I think it's Isadore Loranger, I'm sorry. Isadore Joseph Loranger, let me just see. Now, thankfully this man was a big shot in Yolo County in Madison. So we have, I guess he's called IR, but in my research, it's been I Joseph. So that's neither here nor there. But let's have a look at IR Loranger. Was a native of Monroe County, Michigan, where he was born on November 6, 1897. Further down, his parents were moved to Wayne County in the same state, locating on the present site of Detroit. Now, and then he removed to Yolo. So I know it's the same guy. Now, I've got to find out where he was born in Michigan, or not where he was born, but where his father was. So let's go back and find out his father. So now I'm like, what would his father's name be? What was a Loranger? And I came up with a Joseph Loranger, and it said it was one of the early pioneers of the Western County, aged 79. And then it said his remains will be taken to Monroe for interment. That's where he said he was from. Okay. But again, it could be another Joseph Loranger. How can I look for this? I can look in the Last Will and Testament of Joseph Loranger of Detroit. It names his wife, Rosalie Loranger. And Then it says Isidore R. Loranger, residing in California. And that is my proof that I need that this is the family. So now I let go of Isidore and I keep going to Joseph. Let's find Joseph. And we know that he married a woman named Rosalie. So the marriage certificate between Joseph Loranger and Rosalie Chabard is her name. Now, remember we talked about the marriage record. It's the same thing on this day in 1859, on the 5th day of the month of October, we married Joseph Loranger, fils majeur, that means he was a major age, and de Claude Loranger and Marguerite Melançon, natif de la paroisse de diocèse de Québec, de Saint-Antoine. So now he's from the parish of Saint-Antoine in Quebec. That's where his parents are from. And so they are now residing in the Western Territory. But we now know that in order to find his baptismal, we are going to have to find it in Quebec, in a paroisse, and it has to be these people, Claude and Marguerite. Let's see if we can find a Joseph. Can you imagine, without those names, it could be any Joseph Loranger. But we found him in Yamashis, Quebec, and it's the baptismal record that in 1782, on the 19th of February, they baptized Joseph, son of Claude Loranger and Marguerite Melançon. So now we've brought him back. We've come all the way from California, through Michigan, into Quebec. Let us see the line. And we have Aurame Loranger, her father, Beaumont, that we looked at, Isidore, Joseph Loranger, and we have Claude Rivard Loranger. And now, with a couple skips, we have Joseph Rivard de Loranger. Marie-Michel Roy was the mother. And we go back to Michel Roy, de Châtellerault. And we find our fille du roi, Françoise Aubé. And that, my friends, is the journey that the fille du roi can take us on from California, a small place, all the way back. So she was from France. You know, she did have French roots, but they went way, way back. So it was thrilling for my client to discover that that she had this French Canadian heritage. Through this, we also found out that we were cousins because I am a product of the Rivard line, not the Loranger line, but we were cousins. Now, let me show you something I did do for your association, for your group, because I wanted to see the descendants who helped found Detroit. So I made a list. I went through and I made a list of all the filles du roi or filles mariées or even a grandmother. So Françoise Aubé actually had 3 sons that were with the Cadillac convoy. We have so many others, and I want to say their name: Etienne Alton, Françoise Aubé, Madeleine Bally, Marianne Beaumont, Marie-Claude Chamois, Claude de Chaprenville dit La Fontaine, Jeanne Taudier, Élisabeth Gobinet, Françoise Gobineau, Matrène Graton, Jeanne Saint-Père, Catherine Lalard, Louise Lecoutre, Catherine Lorion, Catherine Moitié, Marie-Geneviève Pelmarel, Père Poisson, Françoise Radisson, Marie Richard, and Marguerite Richer. These are amazing women who gave birth, because their influence wasn't just for Quebec, but look at what they did for Detroit. So I thought that was amazing when I stumbled upon this concept of looking up these women. And let's have a look. So the filles du roi were the most amazing women who founded and grew French Canada and beyond. Their legacy lives on throughout North America as we find more and more descendants. Their bravery, their strength, and their determination to create a family meant they saved New France, they really did, from extinction and ensure the French Canadian population of Quebec and beyond today. We are eternally grateful for their sacrifice. Thank you and merci. Let me stop sharing. There we go.